wieldy, so we'd like to be able to group files in folders or have more complex folder hierarchies. So what we can do there is we can actually specify files in different folders. So there's actually a bit of an error on this. I tried to change it just before the start of the lab, but assume that these two files swap places. So assume that the computer.gif is in the images folder and mycomputer.html is in the introduction to HTML folder. If you have, so let's say in the same folder as your HTML file, you have a folder, and in that folder you have an image. You can specify that the browser should look in that folder by giving first the name of that folder, then a /, and then the browser will look in there. Let's say you have, in that introduction to HTML folder, you have images, and then inside images you have a second folder, my folder. You could specify that contained computer.gif. You could specify a link to that computer.gif with images / my folder / computers.gif. So this chains. So yeah, if you want to be able to access if you want to be able to look down the folder hierarchy, so to speak, you can just specify the names of folders. Let's say, however, you have a situation more like this, so without swapping those two files. So you have mycomputer.html inside a folder, which is contained in another folder which contains the file you want to link to. In that case, you can imagine that every folder contains a hypothetical file called .. and .. is a link to the folder that contains that folder. So if I, so like this, so we've got a folder site. Inside site, we have computer.gif. Inside the src folder, which is underneath site, we have mycomputer.html. So we then call .. You can think of that as like a magical folder that links to the file above it. In fact, actually, if you are dealing with Unix or Linux-based systems, every folder does, in fact, actually have two special files. One is called .. which is a link to that folder, and .. which is a link to its parent. But that's beyond the scope of this course. But yeah, essentially you have .. as a reference to the folder containing the current folder. And yes, you can go up and down as many layers as necessary. Just be careful also, something I've seen a lot of students do, if you start a file path with a / it will expect, or the browser will expect that it will start looking in the root directory of the file system. So don't start with a / if you're going to use relative pathing like this. Either start with a .. or start with a file name. Unless, of course, that's what you want. But if you don't want to specify the full file path, don't start with /. So yeah, that's relative referencing. So we can specify the location of a file relative to the current folder. We can also specify an absolute reference. So in this case, an example here, we're giving just a full URL for a file that's located on the web. So two types of elements that you can have on pages. So any element on a HTML page, so when it's being displayed in the browser, it's what's known as a display property. So the two most common, and the two that you will need to know about, are display and block. So block elements, when they display on the page, they will take up the full width of the page, and then they create a new line afterwards. So examples of these are things like paragraph tags, header tags, list item tags. You can also have inline elements. Inline elements only expand to take as much space as necessary, so they're as wide as the element, as the content they contain, and then they do not create new lines. So, and examples of those are things like strong, emphasis A, image tags, and so on. So I think I can do it might be easier to demonstrate this with a quick example. So if I open up Notepad and just zoom in, I'll just increase the font size. If this is too small for anyone up the back, please just shout out and I can increase it. But so we'll create a really quick HTML page. Give it a title just because. And so in the body, so we can see that we've got block tags. So let's put some text, sample text, and we're going to tag that with a P. And then let's have a inline element, or let's have two of them. So we'll have an image, actually, do I have access to a easy image? Let's just put something that won't resolve to anything. So let's save that. Save that on desktop as example.html. And then what we're going to do is open that in Chrome. Okay, we'll have to get out of the, that'll work. So we'll click and drag that into here. So we can see if I then bring up the developer console. So I went through this in the workshop last week. There's a slide on it later in this lecture. But if I go to Tools, go to More Tools, JavaScript console or Developer Tools, we'll go to the JavaScript console. You can see that we have, so actually we can see in the JavaScript console we've actually got an error saying that it couldn't find that file or the image that I tried to link it to. So that's actually a, if you've ever got problems with your page, so if you're, let's say you write some HTML, or this will be even more useful when you get to JavaScript, and something's not, something odd is happening, bring up the JavaScript console. You might find that it will give you an error that describes kind of what is happening. So in this case, we can see, oh, hang on, that image isn't there. I open up the JavaScript console, failed to load resource, file not found. And then if I click on that, I can actually, I can see where the file is supposed to be. And that should be, because that's in a file, it should have been telling me where on the line, but it doesn't matter. But if I go to Elements, so what I can also do is I can see the source for the page. And what I can do is if I mouse over individual elements, so I mouse over the HTML tag, and it will highlight everything on the page corresponding to that element. Same for the body, so everything that's visible is body, so it highlights that. Now let's highlight over the image tag. We can see that the image tag is only as wide as the content it contains, so as the image. The actual element on the page is only that wide. However, if I mouse over that text, that's in a P tag. You can see that the element, despite the fact that that text is only, you know, a very small percentage of the page, it's taking up the full width of the page, and then it's started a new line. I haven't specified that there was to be a new line after this P tag. It's just putting it there and then putting an image after it on a new line. If I were to copy this image tag again, so now let's refresh this, you can see here that these two inline elements, so they only take as much space as they have to for the content that they contain, and there's no new line after them. However, for a block element, it takes the full width of the page and then puts a new line. So these are display properties and inline versus block. And if I go back to the slides, you can see here that things like, say, paragraphs or headers, that kind of makes sense that they would expand to fill out a large area. But things like, say, an EM or a strong tag, so let's say you have a paragraph of text and you want to bold a one word, it wouldn't really do to make a EM tag, therefore, a block element, because that would immediately put a new line in and it would sort of split the paragraph. So, yeah, you have block elements and inline elements. This will become really important once we start on CSS next week. But yeah, it's also something that you should be aware of, is that different elements have different display properties, and the display properties are very important to do with how those elements appear on the page and essentially the size and way in which they interact. So we've seen a number of different tags so far. Header tags, or H1 through H6 tags, P tags, image tags, body tags, so on. But HTML5 also gives us a number of other tags. Specifically, I'm referring to the structural semantic tags. So structural semantic tags, these allow you to, again, define I suppose, kind of a semantic structure for your whole page. You have tags such as header. So this is in contrast to the head tag. So head tag is the metadata for a full HTML document. Header, it refers to an actual physical header that appears on a page. So let's say let's say you've got a web page. You don't have any of these structural elements on it, but you might have. It might look something like. Might look something like the University of Sydney front page. So let's say you've got HTML, something like this. You might put the HTML for this section up here inside the header tags. You might put the HTML for this section inside, say, a nav tag. And then you might put a section for this area here, and each of these different groups might be put into an article tag. So you can use these structural semantic tags to provide an additional level of semantic structure to group the content on your pages. These are very useful for a number of reasons, not least because you can use them, again, to help you define CSS rules, because you might say you might have an aside, so a section of text that's useful but not, or some links or resources that are useful but not essential to the use of the page. You might decide that on a full someone loads your page on a desktop browser, it might display like this, but let's say then they open it on a really small device, so they open it on their phone. You might decide that we'll actually drop the aside. So you can use this to choose to display certain sections and not others, depending on the browser size that's being used or something like that, or user preferences. You can also use it to easily change the structure of your page with reference to how all the different groups of content are positioned. And also they're quite useful to search engines, in that search engines can use these to, I suppose, identify, let's say, look for the nav on a page and use that to then identify the sublinks or subsections on your page. So when you search for something in Google, it might be able to give you a bit more detailed information than just the name of the page. You also have two other tags, div and span. So these are two other tags you can use to group content, much like the semantic tags I had on the previous slide. The difference, or div and span, they both group content. The difference is divs are block elements by default, and span are inline elements. So if you want to, for example, group some text in a paragraph, you'd be using a span because you don't want to use a block element and split the paragraph. If you want to group something more like, say, a section or a header, then you could use a div should you want to. So yes, I think I was actually asked in one of the tutorials last week, what's the difference between them and why would you use one over the other? Well, I suppose section and article tags, or the semantic tags, you might use those when there's an actual semantic meaning behind the grouping. Div and span, you can use those when you're sort of doing it more for styling purposes. You're trying to group some content because you'll know that you want to be defining some CSS rules to act on this group of or these group of elements. There's no sort of semantic meaning behind that grouping, but just the elements are grouped for other reasons, and you know that you need to be able to perform some kind of stylistic, or you need to perform some kind of style operations on them.